Here, Bob.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jill Vitale-Aussem with the Eden Alternative. Thanks for joining us today for this Eden Alternative live show. I'm really excited to have Bob Kramer with us today. And what we're going to be talking about is rethinking aging services. And Bob, as if you don't know him yet, you'll get to know him today through the show. But Bob's always been thinking about disruption and how do we do things better. He's a visionary, and what we're seeing is that in this incredibly difficult time with the pandemic, that there are lessons to be learned. And while it is extremely challenging, this can provide a launch pad for our field to think about things differently and do things differently. So if you are joining us live, we encourage you to use the comment box. Let us know you're here, put in questions and comments, and we'll be pulling up questions whenever we're able and asking Bob to respond to those. So I met Bob. I had known of him for a lot of years, and I met him at Cornell University. I don't know if Bob remembers, but for me, it was kind of one of those pivotal moments to meet Bob Kramer at the Cornell Institute for Healthy Futures meeting. And when I heard Bob start talking, I was thinking, okay, he at the time you were with the National Investment Center for Senior Housing and Care, and I thought, well, he's going to be talking about numbers and financial stuff, and he did talk about all that. But the rest of what he said also blew my mind with the focus on quality of life and thinking about aging in a different way. And I just thought, wow, there is such alignment and synergy with the Eden Alternative. So I'm thrilled now, years later, to have Bob joining us today. And Bob, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about you?
Sure, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you, Jill, for this opportunity to join the broader community of those that are passionate about what Eden Alternative, what it represents, and what it's trying to do in the field of aging and aging services. I first got exposed to the whole field of aging as a state legislator. I was known as a consumer rights advocate, and this was in Maryland in the early 80s. And there was a troubled not-for-profit CCRC, and I was asked to serve on the state task force to rewrite the CCRC regs. And literally, when I got the call from the speaker, I turned to my aide with my hand over the speaker of the phone and said, "What the heck's the CCRC?" So that was like 1983, and a lot of learning since then. As soon as some have described me as a serial social entrepreneur. I've started 5 different national nonprofits in 5 different issue areas, but this one really stuck. And my involvement in aging, the field of aging services. So I started NIC in 1991, seeing that in the future, looking down to the arrival of the boomers, we're going to have enormous demand for aging services. And I believe that it was going to be critical that the private sector and private sector capital be brought to the table. Because even then, I didn't see the public sector having the funds to do this for everybody. So started NIC with that whole idea, and really driven by the theme of transparency, and good data leads to trust and credibility, something that is rather apropos today in this current environment as well. So started NIC in 91. That grew through the years, and we became not only trusted in terms of our data and our analytics, but also in terms of thought leadership, which has always been a passion of mine. Where are we going in the future? And particularly connecting ideas, people, trends, and business sectors to think about what's this mean for aging services, what's it mean for seniors housing and care. I stepped out of the CEO role of NIC in 2017, continued in a full-time strategic advisor role, and then the first of the year, reduced that time commitment to NIC. So that's a quick summary. So a lot of years in really since the mid 80s, I've been involved in the seniors housing and care field, and it's been a delight. But there's no more transformative time than the period we're going through right now.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know it's a big topic, but how do you think that the pandemic, how do you think it's going to impact our field? How will it change course? What opportunities are there?
Well, let me answer that in two parts. The first part, because it really ties into why I started Nexus Insights in the first place. Haven't been sitting around for the last 3 months thinking, gee, I want to start an organization or a new venture. In fact, I promised my wife that was something I was not going to do. And literally, as late as the first week of March, that was not on my mind. But then what happened? What happened then was not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but in particular, I saw that I've been a longtime fan of Clay Christensen, who recently passed away, Harvard Business School professor, who's considered the father of sort of modern thinking about innovation. And he talks about continuous innovation and disruptive innovation, both important, not one's not good and one's not bad, but and then he talks particularly, though, about sort of moments of disruptive innovation and how critical it is to recognize that and to be on the side of that disruption, or else if you're in business, you get disrupted right out of business. And so, for instance, as recently as the NIC Spring Conference in San Diego, I gave a talk in which I talked about the future, and I talked, say, among other things, about telehealth and trends I thought would take 3 to 6 years to happen in terms of how they would impact senior living and senior care, happened in 3 to 6 weeks in March and April. And I realized that this was at least for me, and I'm one of those early stage, or whatever we call ourselves, baby boomers, born right after World War II. For me, this was a once in a lifetime disruptive moment. Secondly, it was a disruptive moment that even from the start had older adults in the bullseye in terms of impact, in terms of obviously vulnerability, but also therefore putting under a microscope our attitudes towards older adults, towards aging services. So for me, it was, I can't sit on the sidelines when all this is happening. And then I was further moved by the concept best articulated, actually, of all people, by Henry Kissinger in a Wall Street Journal piece on the coronavirus, where he said that, the task of leaders is to while managing through the crisis, to also anticipate and plan for the future. And never has that been more important than now, where literally, rightly, providers of aging services of all sorts are just doubled down on trying to think, how do we best protect and care for, particularly folks that we could speak to, serve in groups. Now we can't. What does that mean? So on and so forth. So this incredibly disruptive moment, which also was revealing what I might call the dark underside and consequences of the attitudes we've had towards aging services, the paradigm, and towards aging. So I see this as an unprecedented opportunity, but also an unprecedented challenge. In the words of Clay Christensen, this is a time where if you don't understand the disruption going on, you will be disrupted right out of business. And so for me, it's the speed of change going on, the fact that while we're full throttle engaged in serving and protecting older adults, we got to be thinking about the future. We got to be thinking about what, as I have said, what will be the new normal, because there will be a time when we'll look at this pandemic in the rearview mirror, but we will never go back to the old normal. So what's that new normal going to look like?
Yeah, so, and that's such a, that's one of the things, Bob, I'm so glad you brought that up. you know, when we work, the Eden Alternative, we work with organizations all around the world. And, you know, it's so hard for leaders right now. They've got their heads down and they're focused on the immediate crisis. But how do you find that space to think a little bigger and think to the future? And it's really interesting, the learning that can come from this too. Like, we are making assumptions about things. And what we're finding in some of the nursing homes is, and we've heard this from several different countries, is, you know what, the people that live here say that it feels more like home right now. And we actually talked with Angie McAllister from Signature earlier this week on this show, and she said people are happy not to be shuffled from planned activity to planned activity. And maybe this is the meaning we've been trying to figure out, you know, that meaning in a full life doesn't come from a full programmed activities calendar kind of thing. So fascinating. You know, when you did your the senior living foresight,
the virtual summit,
summit, you talked about some of the other opportunities that come from this. And one of the things you had said is policy changes at the stroke of a pen. Is that what you're talking about with this quick change that happened?
Yes, that's part of it. I mean, obviously, telehealth, I just, you know, in February for an issue I had, an orthopedic issue, I saw my orthopedic surgeon who's 72. And I commented to him I was going to give this talk about telehealth and senior care in a couple of weeks at the NIC Spring Conference. And his literal words to me, "Oh, Bob, I'm 72. I don't have to worry about that. I won't be dealing with that before I retire." Fast forward, it's late March, and I have my follow-up appointment. I get a call from his office saying, he's not seeing patients in the office, but he'll be keeping this appointment via telehealth. Is that all right with you? And I laughed. But here, in the course of weeks, he went from, I'm 72, that isn't even an issue for me, to not only had he adopted it, but he had to adopt it because otherwise he wouldn't have any patients, because the patients didn't want to come and sit in his office. And so he now not only had the need, he also had the payment model, because CMS, by strokes of a pen almost every day, is creating opportunities for new models to be embraced that before, because of regulatory restrictions and especially payment, couldn't be done. And so to me, that's really exciting. And so I want to be sensitive to those participating in this webinar. I mean, everyone from the front line to the senior executive in an organization is under enormous stress and pressure now. You know, one of my colleagues, Dwayne Clark, said, well, that we're fighting, in essence, 3 wars now. The first war is against a pandemic that is particularly cruel and fatal to many older adults. The second war we're fighting is economic survival. Many companies and many organizations in our field, but also more broadly, restaurants, you know, hotels, all sorts of small businesses. It's a war for how long will this present situation last, and do we have the resources to survive? Can we keep our employees? So forth. And then the third war is public perception and media perception. So you're basically fighting 3 wars at the same time and trying to plan accordingly for how to respond. So you're getting attacked and vilified in the press, and attacked for lack of transparency, where oftentimes if you were transparent on what you know today, you'd have to say, honestly, we don't know. Why? Because we don't have access to the tests to test people who are asymptomatic. So if we tell you this is the number of confirmed cases, once we're able to test everyone who's asymptomatic, it may go up significantly.
Right.
So, you know, anyway, that's just an example.
I'm curious so that's one of the things that has been pretty apparent is that third war the third battle that you talked about, which is the perceptions. And there is such difference, and it's changing a little bit, but there's in general such a difference between the way hospitals and those that work in hospitals are portrayed in the media right now and those who work in aging services, particularly nursing homes. Why do you think that is? Like, what's behind that?
Well, I think there's several things. First of all, post-acute care and skilled nursing has only begrudgingly been seen as kind of well, one person described it as it's always been at the kids' table in the healthcare continuum. I would say it's often been in the basement in terms of the healthcare continuum, not really given much resources, but oh yeah, they're there. And senior care hasn't even been at the table, any table. Now, all of a sudden, that paradigm has been flipped. But most public policy and many healthcare policies are yet to catch up with that. In other words, in this epidemic, we are the key frontline workers. As I did a sort of an extended metaphor in a blog post I did, our senior housing and care workers, and whether it's home care services, home health care, whether it's seniors housing or whether it's skilled nursing, we are the volunteers who are going into the burning building when everyone else is trying to escape. We're going to the most dangerous territory where the infection spreads most easily. Secondly, we're doing it being told we have no knowledge where the enemy is. You got to figure it out yourself. That's inadequate access to tests, and particularly tests that give you rapid results. A test that you get back in 9 days is not really helpful.
Right.
And then next to all, we're fighting the battle being told you're on your own to develop and find your own ammunition and weapons. We don't have enough PPE to spare. And as is demonstrated in our second-class status, we weren't even level 1 priority for all of those things. And we're still fighting to get that. And those skilled nursing is beginning to get that. Some private pay seniors housing still hasn't gotten there, still hasn't been recognized. So, and then lastly, we're getting not just differing orders, we're getting directly conflicting orders from different generals in the fight. The county health officer, the state health department or state governor, and the federal level. At times, even in the battle to how do you report and who do you report to, and how do you categorize the different degrees of who's been exposed, who's confirmed, so forth. At times, completely different ways of measuring it between your county, your state, and the feds. And oh yes, do this when you still don't have priority access to the tests you need, to the supplies you need, and you're on your own to get all of that. But you're held accountable for the results. You got to defend this territory. And if you don't, you're the keys to making sure our hospitals and our ICUs are not overwhelmed. Because if you don't do your job, they will be. So that's the challenge. The opportunity is, the reality is, this is the first time people have woken up to see what a key role we play. This is the first time, CMS has had to make changes to recognize this. And it's the first time where we're likely to be considered in legislation about the healthcare workforce. Before, we never were. So I tend to be a glasses half full person, which perhaps you can tell. And so I look to the opportunities. But I do think that the other thing is we've got to recognize that at times we've been our own worst enemy. Mm-hmm. And we have to ourselves be willing to be self-critical about the model of aging and aging services that even we in the field and in the sector have bought into. And I'll give you an example that's personally embarrassing, but it's because we don't realize how we all buy into it. A number of years ago, and I give enormous credit to the individual, I was invited to speak to the board of an organization. I was asked to share my slides beforehand because this was a heavy hitter group, and wanted to make sure there were no embarrassments here. And in a slide, I had a picture of a huge wave. And it was a throw-off comment, but it was a comment about the coming wave or tsunami of elders. And the person wrote back and said, I love your thought, but don't you use that phrase in front of my board. And she was absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, when you use the phrase the coming tsunami of elders, has anything good come out of a tsunami? A tsunami is an unmitigated disaster. And what we're saying is the coming aging of our society is an unmitigated disaster. So, you know, we got to change our own paradigm for the way we talk about. Aging is a process. Older adults have enormous things to contribute. I wouldn't give anything. I'm delighted for what I feel to be the wisdom that comes from experience and time. But at the same time, yeah, I recognize there are things I used to be able to do physically at 21 and stamina that I don't have now in my early 70s. But I think the biggest thing I would say and is we have all bought into a dependency model, of what I call a dependency model in aging services and therefore in aging, where you have infant care, you have toddler care, and you have senior care. But with infants and toddlers, we see all the future potential. The investment is worth it. With senior care, particularly in this present crisis, there have been a lot of doubts about whether or not the investment is worth it. But that comes because of a dependency model where we view older adults as primarily they're finished, they're constructive giving to society. They're more takers. And yes, a generous, a moral society commits to take care of them. But we also recognize that, you know, their sort of constructive engagement is over. And I say, well, I won't say it, but absolutely.
You can say it. Oh.
Bullshit. I mean, that's just not true. If we need older adults more than ever, and in the coming crises that we have in caregiving, in mentoring, in education, just to go through a few areas, we need our older adults, many of whom are going to live well into their 90s and to 100. We need them engaged. And this idea that at age 65, when you may have half of your adult life and a third of your life ahead of you, that at 65, you're now going to retire into the sunset and expect public benefits to care for you for the rest of your life. You know, we know from the work of Becca Levy at Yale that when older adults imbibe a philosophy of dependency and that they have little value to offer to society, what happens is it lowers their lifespan by as much as 7.5 years, because they adopt this attitude of dependency that I don't really have value anymore, which is just not true. It's absolutely not true. So, you know, we can't expect the country to change its attitudes until we're first willing to be self-critical of what we've bred. I put it in terms of seniors housing and care that we followed this sort of acuity creep of all of our residents. And so we stopped having our main value proposition being social engagement and connection and human connection and purpose. And instead we just sold care. Well, now just selling care is not such a good thing. Care needs to be there. It needs to be good. But, you know, care alone, people can get care because of telehealth. In a pandemic, it can be seen to be safer to stay at home than to be in a congregate setting.
Right. And I just want to jump in, because that now you all who are watching know why I was so excited to meet Bob and to have Bob come talk to us. But you know, with you know what you're talking about with older people being seen as just recipients of services and care, and you know, that's what we've been working on with Eden Alternative forever. Mm-hmm. That people need the opportunity to give as well as receive care. And there's also all kinds of research, you know, and you cited that research about what we view about aging, but tons of research that shows when you have meaningful purpose in your life, you have higher immunity, you have less negative health outcomes. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting right now, and again, I think you're right, is how do you change a whole society? But you can change, especially for those folks out there who are running senior living communities, nursing homes, is you can shift things there. Because the way people are being, the way older people, everything you read right now is frail elders who need protection. Frail elders who need protection. How do we take care of these poor, frail elders? And we're not really focused on the incredible human potential and capital we have with older people right now. And we're perpetuating those stereotypes. And so you start thinking about how is this the way people are being portrayed right now in the midst of this pandemic? How is that going to impact health outcomes in the future?
Yeah.
When even more and more, we're getting those messages that being old equals being dependent, being frail, being at risk. So I don't know it's pretty big. It's pretty big.
It's big, but in transformative moments in societies, and we're in such a moment. We're in a transformative moment that's much bigger than aging and aging services. But unlike some other transformative moments, we're at the very center of this rather than being on the periphery. That's a huge opportunity. We have an audience we've never had. Yes, we may not like a lot of the front page stories and editorials going on, but the very fact that they're focused on the role of older adults and how we treat them, that's moving a long ways from ignoring. Basically, for poor frail elders, we've followed a policy of what I don't know about, I don't have to worry about or be accountable for.
That's a good point.
So I see opportunity here. That said, I think that one of the key things is, let me sort of,
and I want to know when we have a minute, we have a question from Ethan, but we can wait until you finish your thought.
Let me just say that I think there are two very differing sort of what I'd call views of retirement and of aging. One's what I call the D word concept, which is the dependency model. It's a declinist model that you reach some age, 65, 75, whatever it is, and the rest of life is all decline. And you disengage or disconnect, that's retirement. And then you're in this decline to the ultimate form of disappearance, which is death. And I contrast that then to what I call the engagement model of aging and retirement, where it's about engagement, excitement. It's about ongoing learning, and that engagement model to me is critical, because if you think about it, I've visited hundreds of different types of senior care communities, but I've never met a resident who wanted to be defined by their chronic conditions, their ADL limitations, their number of medications, or their ability to pay. But those are things we've become really good at defining people by. What we're not really good at defining them by is what are their life's passions? What are their life joy moments, or the things that give them a sense of purpose and meaning? And, I love a statement by Lisa Marsh Ryerson, who gave one of our NIC talks, and she challenged senior care providers and said, you need to rethink your activities directors. They need to be purpose matchmakers. And I love that phrase. And with that, we need to think about retirement, and therefore retirement living, as refirement, not retirement. That the word retire means to go away. Yeah. And we're just entertaining people till they go away. That's not what I'm interested in. I want to refire.
I remember hearing you talk once, and I think it might have been at Cornell, but or somewhere else where I heard you speak, and you were talking about that the whole idea of retirement was based on years ago when people only lived to a certain age. And so playing golf for a couple of years was okay, right? Sitting back and doing nothing.
You didn't have very long to enjoy those things.
Now with this longer lifespan, we have never rethought what that means.
And again, my father-in-law, who was a longtime school teacher and reading specialist on Long Island, he retired a few years early because he had a heart attack. That was at 62. He passed away at 93. And he was part of the greatest generation. He was a World War II vet, but he spent half of his adult life in retirement and a third of his entire life. That's not good for your health.
Right.
And what happens then is that actually lifespan can seem like a cruel thing to people who don't have their health span nearly match their lifespan. And then ultimately also their wealth span. So you got three things. And ideally you want the three to line up. You don't want just to live to 100, but to live 30 years able to not do any of the things you considered so important that define you as a person.
Yeah.
So, I think this is, we need to be thinking about these things. I'll add this one other thing. Ultimately, what it means, this is a two-way street, because there's one other thing about boomers. There's one E word, all the positive E words, engagement, excitement, experience, all of those things. There's one other word about boomers, entitled. And one of the dangers is that boomers come off as entitled. In other words, I've earned this and don't touch my benefits and I don't have to give back. I've already, in a sense, paid my dues to society. And, I've often put it this way. One of the keys for our society, and I would argue across all developed nations, but I'll just focus on the United States, is will boomers over the next 30 years be viewed as those who were willing and wanted, or unwilling and unwanted? Willing to give back, willing to be part of the solution in terms of the needs for caregiving, mentoring, teaching, and just contributing back their expertise to help society, for instance, recover from this pandemic, which is going to have a devastating long-term economic impact. Are they willing and are they wanted? Does society want their input? Or are they unwilling? No, I just want my entitlement programs and don't you ask me to give anything back. And are they unwanted? There's a real danger as even we seek now to get the economy hopefully safely restarted. There's a danger that not only will seniors housing and care, the nursing home setting, the congregate setting, be seen as the culprit, willingly or unwillingly, rather than the casualty of this war, but even older adults broadly will be seen as the culprit. Why? Well, if you didn't exist, if you just would go die off, we wouldn't have to have all these restrictions. We wouldn't have to put on masks. If you all would just go die off, our economy would be saved. And so we create these false trade-offs, but they're false trade-offs that make the older adult, simply by their age, the villain, the culprit. And rather than
the othering that goes on, right? That's And so part of that, I'm guessing, is that we all have these internalized views of aging from all of the years we've been fed a bunch of false information about aging, right? And so it really, for people to step up and say, and I love that, willing and wanted, is you have to change the way you think about age.
Yeah.
In your own head, right?
And
because we've been taught when you reach a certain age, you don't give anything back. You don't have anything to give, and we buy into it.
But as you referred to earlier, Jill, study after study, whether it's folks that focus on different forms of dementia. We now know the work of Dr. Carol Barnes at University of Arizona. People can do autopsies of brains of people who have fully developed Alzheimer's but have never shown the symptoms. But the characteristic of those people, I'm not saying it's the only thing, is that they had a strong sense of purpose and they were very, very engaged. Now, this is different from early onset Alzheimer's, let me say, but some of her research is just is
Mhm.
because what it shows is, again, and we know this from common sense, but the research shows this. If you have a sense of purpose, a sense of engagement, a sense of no, I need to get up and get going because people are dependent upon me. So I recognize for some people this is foreign. They've had this goal of retirement all their lives, and that's where, to Lisa Marsh Ryerson's point, our activities directors need to help them refire that
Yeah.
sense of purpose. What gives you a sense of human connection, belonging? The longtime Surgeon General under President Obama, Vivek Murthy, has just come out with a great new book, which is it's called Together, but it's all about the role of social connection. And I think one of the most damaging things is that we come up with this phrase social distancing. Really, what we should have said is we want you to physically distance while making extra efforts to socially engage. And
Absolutely.
nowhere is that more true, and nowhere do we have to be more creative in that than in our field. So
It's really interesting. I think right now the other thing that we can learn, and one of my team members, Denise Hyde, just did a little a Facebook live about this yesterday. Is we in the Eden Alternative, we always talk about loneliness, helplessness, and boredom, and how devastating it is to well-being. And so many of us are experiencing that right now. A lot of people have lost their purpose. If people have lost their jobs, and you see so many people trying to find purpose right now. So how can I reach out to my neighbors? How can I do something to help people? And it really just shows, yes, you could be sitting around getting paid and doing nothing, but it's not human nature. Like, we need to give back. And I think there's an amazing opportunity right now for us, if we can find that space to reflect and learn. What does it really feel like to be lonely, like many older people are? What does it feel like to be helpless, not have any opportunity to give back? What does it feel like to be bored? And it's so painful that people are like, I'll risk my health because I don't like feeling this way.
yeah.
It's just
That's a terrific point, and I'll use that point to that I've been pointing out. A number of experts, futurists have been sort of, this is, and if in our field, it reminds me of 2009 and 10, where all the experts said that the entrance fee CCRC was dead. It would never recover. The model was gone. By 2015, as the NIC data showed, it was and has been the last 5 years, it's been the strongest performing model of senior living out there. But a lot of people have been declaring the death of the congregate setting. And I would really challenge that. Part of that reason is, okay, in those heartwarming, compelling pictures of people serenading people on their birthdays, standing outside a window, of people standing on their balconies waving, of also stories in all the major newspapers about people going nuts, as you said, being cooped up in their small space. And, they're dying to get out and see friends. They're dying to be able to be hugged. They're dying for human connection. And so I would argue that the very response society has had to physical distancing and to self-quarantining has demonstrated that we're wired as human beings to long for that sense of connection, and that in and of itself gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's why I think the Vivek's new book is so timely and so powerful. But and we have an opportunity to lead in this area.
What's that book again? In case I know I want.
It's called Together. And
okay.
I forget the subtitle, but it's Vivek, Dr. Vivek Murthy, and he was Surgeon General under Barack Obama. Right. And it's basically the importance of human connection, and in giving one a sense of life purpose and meaning. And again, I think he's spot on. What I love about it, he brings tons of research to the table. And something I think our whole field has needed for a long time is someone to really collect all this data and all this research. And because again, now, will we have to have better infection protocols going forward? Absolutely. Is care important? Absolutely. But that'll be an assumed. If we're only about care, then people will just stay home.
Yeah.
But the congregate settings, whether they're PACE models, whether they're day type programs, this is where we're going to be able to give people a sense that they're part of community, and it's a two-way street, that we need them just as much as they need us, that we get away again from that dependency model. So to me, we have exciting opportunities. We have the stage, we have the spotlight. It's glaring on us. It's painful. In many instances, we're not used to it, and we're not ready for it. But this is, I mean, we're learning lessons through this as a society, and we're learning lessons for this as those that care about older adults. As we look to, I mean, just simply the amount of debt we'll face as a country. Anyone that thinks that we're going to have a totally public sector driven effort to address all the needs in aging services for the next 30 years, I think you're dreaming. So first of all, we got to change attitudes. We've got to see that it's a two-way street. In one sense, the very boomers that responded to things like the Peace Corps in the 60s are the very boomers that now need to stand up and respond to society needs them more than ever, not less than ever. You know, we need to for them to set an example and to encourage those that are 5, those that are 15, and those that are 35. I mean, millennials, I've called them the triple mortgage generation. First mortgage, student debt. Second mortgage, the house. Third mortgage, long-term care for their parents or even grandparents. And now, however much money you had as of March 1st, except for very few people, you're probably poorer today in terms of your savings. And maybe you're out of a job. Yeah. And so just the need for social cohesion, and I think older adults have an enormous role to play in promoting social cohesion. And they can look back at times when they realize that that's social cohesion and what that means for society.
So Bob, I want to, so with Nexus Insights, what part of this are you hoping to shift? Like, what's your vision? What's your goal for this new organization that you've launched?
Well, really our tagline, rethinking aging from every angle, is at the key. In other words, when you're in a disruptive moment, you better be speaking into it. And you better be speaking into it in a way that's anticipating where we're going. It's like the classic Wayne Gretzky quote that everybody loves to use, you know, I skate to where the puck's going to be, not to where it is. Yeah, and so one of the things is we're a little bit more think tanky than we are, you know, consulting company. I'm not trying to start the Accenture of aging services. I've got a wonderful group of advisors, of which you're one, that'll grow. But the idea here is to connect, I would say, leading thinkers with thinking leaders. Not everyone is going to say, look, I can't even think about a year from now. I'm just so focused on survival. And I would say, look, I understand that, but you better have somebody that you trust in your organization who is thinking about that. Otherwise, your survival will actually be undermined because you weren't looking to how this is going to change. How is it going to change, you know, your business model? How is it going to change how you think about the very person you're serving? How are their attitudes towards you and your product going to change? So it's really, our sense is that we're in this unprecedented disruptive moment. I personally want to be putting forth the disruptive ideas and the new actionable transformative models that I think we need to experiment with. I don't have all the answers. Anyone that does is just fooling you. And you know, but the reality is, I think one of the most important things today is to keep in mind 4 or 5 key questions that for any organization, as you're putting your sort of plan together for the future, you say, here are our 5 key questions. Whoever's on the point for us in our organization, every month at least, they have to bring us an update on these 5 key questions, because how these questions pan out could turn upside down our strategic plan that we now have, and whether or not it makes sense.
What would an example of a question be?
Well, I think how long will the impact of the pandemic linger in terms of boomers' fear and society's fear of congregate spaces? You know, as an urban studies major, when I was in undergraduate in the late 60s, you know, we've now had at least a 30-year move in society towards greater density is good. We need to recognize all the opportunities of urban settings, transit-oriented development, smaller spaces, less private space, you know, micro apartments.
Yeah.
All of this has been a movement recognizing economic realities and saying you need a very tiny space, and even there's co-living, there's co-housing, there's co-working. All of those trends are now disrupted. I'm not saying they're going to go away, but they're disrupted. And so I would say the whole view, I mean, if I were in our field, I'd be looking very carefully at what's happening with co-working trends, co-housing, co-living, because right now there's a chill on them and there's a bit of a rethinking.
Right.
And if I were, you know, for instance, as I've been saying over the last few weeks, I think small town America that has cheap land and cheap cost of living, combined with something that gives an added sense of culture to that area in terms of restaurants, like a local university, something that gives a reason for there to be more thriving, both restaurant scene, art scene, maybe sports. I think a lot of people, a lot of boomers are going to give a second look at that setting. And the idea of moving into the city, and think about this, accepting the idea of a 500 square foot apartment that doesn't even have a balcony, so they have no outdoor access and they must use an elevator that everyone else in the building must use. I'm not quite sure that's going to be on the top seller list in the next several years.
Yeah.
So that's just one trend. Another trend I would see is we've now seen a dramatic pendulum shift to a focus on quality of care, which will quite likely lead, unfortunately, to more regulations, not always in a good sense. How quickly will the pendulum swing back in the middle, where we're able to put an emphasis on quality of life and what older adults want out of life, rather than just protecting them in a dependency model from catching a disease? What I'm saying is, it's not that quality of care isn't important. You're going to have to demonstrate your infection control procedures, right down to design. And that means small neighborhood models, for instance, are going to be very popular. They may be in large buildings, but your ability through universal workers and design to be able to take that set of 10 apartments or units and isolate them, not just once a century when there's a pandemic like the 1918 flu or COVID-19, but let's think about this. Now we have a heightened awareness. We suddenly are realizing, you know, there's a flu season every year, and that takes a lot of lives of older adults. And I think families are going to start asking, what do you do every flu season?
Yep.
How set up are you to deal with that in your community? Customers are going to be asking questions they didn't ask before. And if your answer is, well, you know, we love the independence our residents have, and if they get sick, we send them to their local doctor, or if it's serious, or if it happens at 2 a.m., we send them to the hospital. Wrong answer. Won't work in the future. You're going to be out of business.
Wow.
So you got to think about that. If you have a model that depends on people going out to see their doctor, especially when they're sick, family members aren't going to tolerate that in the future. Mom, you're going to send mom to sit in the waiting room in flu season with 9 other people, all of whom are coughing? I'm not going to pay you $6,000 a month to do that.
Wow.
So these are just, so I could go on. I think one of the key issues for our whole field, and particularly for the senior care setting, is how transparent we'll be. I would argue, even if the transparency is painful, the sooner you're transparent. Transparency is key to credibility, and credibility is what earns you trust. And you don't have to be perfect. And in this epidemic, nobody's going to come out as perfect. Everyone's made mistakes. But to maintain your credibility, you've got to be transparent. And that's how you maintain trust. If you're not transparent, you're seen as guilty because you must be holding something back.
Yeah.
And that's a tough situation to be in.
My parents live in a life plan community, and I get phone calls all the time with updates on, we've done this much testing and this is how many positive results we've had back. We're really sorry to tell you that a resident died today. And they do it through an automated call system, but that's the only way to communicate. And my parents get the call at the same time, which it gives all of us so much more, even though it's horrible news. You're right. It's that transparency, and I know nobody's hiding anything, and it makes you feel like we're all in this together.
And that's another area where we won't go back to the old normal. Yeah. One of the things that's happened is that our field has been brought, because of this pandemic, we've been brought into the digital communication era of the 21st century. And for the most part, healthcare broadly, and aging services even more so, has always been a late adopter. We've always been way behind the curve. And now we've been forced to change overnight. And you're not going to go back to, once a year, 2 weeks before you send out the new rates, a note giving them an update on your community. That won't work.
No.
You're going to have, through digital communication, be able to, and just think about this. The universe has been expanded too. Yes, you've got to be communicating with residents and their families. And now you know that you're going to have future flu seasons, and maybe the return, let's hope not, of COVID-19, where residents are got to be able to stay connected with one another digitally. But now you also have to be communicating with staff, and I would argue staff's families. And you have to be communicating with any health providers that are engaged with your residents in your building. And you have to be communicating digitally with health payers, especially in the future, the managed care plans, Medicare Advantage, and managed long-term services and supports plans that serve your residents. All of those folks, not to mention all your different health officials and regulators, are all going to expect continuous communication if you're going to be seen as credible and trustworthy. And you cannot go back to the old way of thinking about communication. It won't work.
I'm so glad that our field has you, who's thinking about all these things. Especially when people don't have the space to maybe think that big, that at least they can take this in and start to think about some of these things. And if you have a couple minutes, there were a couple questions. Are you open?
Absolutely.
So Susan Kimmel, and I think we have Meredith pulling up some of these questions on the screen, but Susan Kimmel asked, will the pandemic spur investment in aging in place? How do you avoid loneliness and maintain engagement?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, because I think, we all know from studies, the AARP studies, everyone says they want to age in place. The issue is not aging in place. The issue is aging in the right place. And that's what's key. And I think economic realities, just as we saw coming out of the Great Recession, economic realities are meaning we're going to have to enable people to age safely in home for a longer period of time, because they're going to have less resources to afford different types of different senior congregate living settings. In terms of the care piece, I'm now talking about the care piece. So telehealth, technology, ways of communicating. That said, here's the danger, and I'm going back to my days as a state legislator in Maryland in the 80s. There was a sweeping movement, quite right, quite compelling, to basically empty out state mental institutions in the 1980s, saying, and there are analogies here, these people don't need to be here. Now, one of the things the advocates said is, but the resources have got to follow them into the community, and not everyone can be cared for in the community setting. What happened? Politicians with budget stresses heard, gee, we can be on the right side of, and we can close our state mental institutions, but they viewed it as a cost-saving plan. And so the dollars really didn't follow, there were far fewer dollars that followed the individual into the community. And B, in some instances, they closed the institutions completely. And a lot of people were literally out on the streets, very little resource support, and literally could not be out safely on the street. And so we're going to be under enormous budget pressures. I would say to those that want to sort of embrace and encourage politicians to embrace the age at home sort of movement, be careful what you wish for, because you may get defunding of all those congregate settings, but not comparable dollars into the community. And that's a huge, I mean, you know, state and local budgets, most of them, they've got to have balanced budgets. Yeah. They can't just rack up debt. And so there are real dangers there. That said, yes, we couldn't build enough congregate housing for all the numbers we've got in the future. We have to enable people to using digital communication, using telehealth, using everything we know to live safely longer at home. But we also have to recognize so much of American housing, it would be very expensive to retrofit it.
Yes.
Very expensive.
And people are isolated. And
people are isolated. You know, we don't need, the danger is we embrace a public policy that produces an epidemic of shut-ins and produces the greatest epidemic of loneliness we've ever experienced, as we have tens of thousands of boomers aging. And again, as another one of my advisors, Sarah Gieber, has rightly pointed out with her book, Solo Aging, you know, boomer women are less likely to have gotten married. When they've gotten married, they're less likely to have children. They're more likely to be divorced. And if they had children, they had fewer children. And those children are likely to live further from them. So we have a lot of solo agers.
Yes.
A huge number of solo agers. And it's an issue at all socioeconomic levels. It's particularly acute at the lower socioeconomic levels. And so we have to be very careful that politicians, because of tight budgets, give us what we ask for. And it turns out to be fanning a new pandemic of loneliness and social isolation. And you know, a lot of the things, for instance, self-driving vehicle technology, and different things that could, I mean, one of the keys is, for instance, there's going to be a lot of hesitancy about transit in the future. Transit was seen as the key in urban settings to enable older folks to get around safely. Well, you know, I think Japan recognized it early, but we're going to, I think, see that the transit is one of the most egalitarian spreaders of diseases. And I think there's going to be a lot of hesitancy about that. And so again, I'm not arguing for one solution opposed to another. I'm just saying, you know, there are a lot of differing trends going on now. I think that I've argued, I think the neighborhood approach, I think both philosophically what you're trying to do through and are doing through Eden Alternative. I think the greenhouse model. There are lots of models out there. My view is we need all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Not one versus another.
Right.
And also because boomers, as soon as you say one size fits all to a boomer, 90% of boomers go out to prove you wrong. Because one of the things boomers want is they want a sense of self-management and self-control and self-direction. So yes, there are boomers, not me, for whom Margaritaville is incredibly attractive. There are other boomers, though, that really want to feel like they're engaged in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue, we're going to see lots of different models, and we need them all. We need models that enable people to live safer, longer at home, whatever home is now. We need models that enable people to have different types of community centers where they can be during the day and have that social engagement. And we need models that are also congregate living models. And especially, I think we're going to see, if we're not, I fear that for the highest acuity, sort of those that truly need 24-hour nursing care, not they're in a nursing home because that's the only place their room and board gets paid for. If we move those out in the community, I think it's more likely we'll abandon them. And that concerns me.
Wow. And do you have a minute for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we've got a lot of conversation going on in the chat box, and I'm pulling out the ones that were actually questions. And it was from, it's probably our friend Rain in South Africa, Eden Alternative South Africa, asking, I'm trying to scroll up and find that comment, asking about why we think that segregating older people to get, is it, here it is, it's not, is it not time that we stop creating places where only older people live exclusively? Why do we think this is a good idea? COVID-19 is shining such a bright light on this strange concept. Any thoughts?
Again, terrific question, not a simple answer. One of the things I'm working on an op-ed piece now, specifically on intergenerational. And one of the questions I ask in there, is it by choice or by necessity? And is it 24/7 or is it 12 hours a day? And I think those are important questions. And that many people sort of just glaze over. And just as I think, the whole move towards both multi-generational, intergenerational communities and mixed use settings, all of those things are going to have some challenges. Everything from in an annual flu season, let alone if it becomes an annual COVID-19 season, are older adults going to want to be 24/7 sharing the same building with people of all ages who may not have the same concern about infection control? But putting even that aside, I think there are people who are going to want and aspire to intergenerational. And 2020, this is the first year where the average American child is being born into a 4-generation family. It's never been our case before, ever. And that has huge implications. Has huge implications for caregiving. For instance, it's a new sandwich generation, but it's also grandparents caring for grandchildren because childcare is too expensive and all kinds of things that are. And so I think the move towards, hopefully some of the licensing barriers at the local community level to granny pods and all sorts of things that have been resisted in many communities will go away, or at least be less intense. But I think there's still one thing that we have to account for, and putting aside sort of public health issues. And that is, I visited a community on the edge of the campus of the University of Washington in Seattle. It's 3 blocks. 1 block is an all ages housing, 1 block is seniors housing, and 1 block is retail, including one of the highest grossing liquor stores in all of Seattle, which has been pointed out with great mirth in the local news press there. Shortly after opening, the all ages housing is primarily grad students and non-tenured professors. So they tend to be young, but not young as in 22, young as in late 20s, 30s, even early 40s. No dining facilities there. Shortly after opening, and they share a common space. This triangle in the center of the triangle, the common space is shared by the two buildings. Not long after opening, the seniors community voted to open up their dining services to the residents across the courtyard. And I arrived there to visit this community several months after this had happened. And I was fascinated to see how this worked. And I was there I toured in the afternoon, I was there for dinner, and I stayed until the dining hall closed and stayed to talk with three older gentlemen, two in their early 90s, one in their late 80s. I said, how do you like this? And, oh, we love it. We're up on politics and campus, and we're up on sports, and we love it. And then one of the guys said, but we really love it at 8:30 when the dining hall closes and they have to go back across the courtyard. I said, why? He said, well, for most of us, we're doing well if we watch the 9 o'clock news. But he said, I used to not want to be disturbed at 2 a.m. in the morning by somebody's party or somebody practicing their musical instrument. Now that's true at 10 a.m. He said, on the other hand, I like to be up at 6. And I'm up whether I want to be or not. I'm up at 6 a.m. And I asked the other guys, and they said, oh, we agree. And they said, what we love is that during the day we have the interaction, but we really love at night that we're not dealing with their parties and their musical instruments. And I thought that was, now again, that's not everybody.
Yeah.
But our biological rhythms do tend to be different. And, the grad student may be up studying until 2 a.m. and may sleep in until 10. To my knowledge, they have very few folks that come over for breakfast.
That is really, and there was a question of what's the name of that community, if you're able to.
It is a Merrill Gardens community. And as I said, it's right on the edge of the Seattle, of the University of Washington campus. And it blew them away by its success. And they've been looking to do similar projects in other areas. Again, especially, they love the idea of proximity to the university campus as well.
That's great. I love it. And Bob, I could listen to you for days on end. We are over an hour. Thank you.
We can get each other excited. The truth be told, Jill, you and I tend to set each other off. So that's dangerous.
It's been great. And I hope that, and I know based on the conversation that I hope you go back and read some of these comments that people are putting in, because people are really engaged in this discussion. I would love to have you come back and talk about progress as this moves along, if you'd be open to that. And I want to thank you for being with us today. And thank you to everybody who was part of this conversation. Gosh, this was such a great topic. And Bob, you're such an amazing person and visionary with all of this. I do want to invite people. So another opportunity this week to rethink, what are we going to learn from this? What will we do differently is we have every Friday at 12:30 Eastern time, we have a Zoom gathering, and I'll ask one of my team members to pop that link in the comment section. But we've got two of the architecture firms that we work with, SWBR out of Rochester and Kephart Architects from out of Denver, who want to come and hear from people about what should we be learning? How does this pandemic potentially impact architectural design for nursing homes, senior living communities? So I hope that you'll come and join and throw your ideas out there. They really want to think about how can architecture serve this field and help us do better. And then next Monday on the show, we have Sue Ellen Beatty and Eric Anderson from Sherbrooke Community Center in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, joining us. And for those of you who know Sherbrooke, they were the first milestone 4 Eden alternative community in the world. They are extremely advanced in all of their practices and their leadership, and they're going to be talking about some of the lessons learned from navigating through the pandemic. So don't miss that. either. Bob, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I know this is what you shared today is really going to make an impact with so many people.
Well, thank you, Jill, for the opportunity. I invite folks to check out our website at nexusinsights.net, and feel free to reach out to me. And I'm excited. I know there's so many people who are thinking about how do we take advantage of this opportunity in a good sense. To think about, I mean, one of the reasons I started Nexus Insights is my view, the status quo is not acceptable. We've got to do not just better, we got to do differently. Clay Christensen likes to talk about how continuous innovation is doing things better. Disruptive innovation is doing things differently. And so that's really what I'm passionate about.
And is there a certain email address people should use if they want to reach out to you?
Yeah, it's very simple. They can send it to rgk@nexusinsights.net. rgk@nexusinsights.net.
Perfect. And we put, I think we'll put that in the comment section too. Oh, and it's up on the screen now as well. Thank you, Bob. Thank you everyone for being with us today.
Great to be able to chat. Thanks so much.